opening remarks to the Nobel Prize winners who gathered at the White House. And he added the following joke, and I'm going to paraphrase. I would say this is really the greatest collection of innovative electricity advocates in the history of New Jersey, with the possible exception of Tom Edison dining alone. But really, this is a very impressive gathering, and I want to pay particular tribute to the Princeton students. I and Grid Alternatives have had the pleasure of working with these students for the last many months. We at Grid, the nation's largest solar energy nonprofit, have been doing this for more than a dozen years. We've installed over 8,000 systems, trained more than 29,000 folks. We have offices in 10 places in the US and in Nicaragua. And I run New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But New Jersey is a special focus of ours, where we've seen, and I've been in this business for more than 2 decades, we've seen New Jersey once be a national leader. And I believe with efforts such as this from the Princeton students and you good folks here today, New Jersey can again be a national leader. So allow me to say thank you to Princeton University and the Woodrow Wilson School for hosting us. It's important, particularly in these times, that progressive folks, people who care about these challenging policy issues, gather together in groups such as this and talk about substance. I want to say to the students, I've lived through other eras when there were not progressive folks committed to such things. And so as we think about the new administration and the next 4 years, I urge the students, if I may quote another president, this time a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, if I can urge the students to be in the arena. Teddy Roosevelt talked about the importance of engagement. What I love about the effort of Gene Fox and Ann Hoskins, the 2 professors, I should say, given my many appearances in front of them, commissioners, when I first came to the class, I was a little nervous, having appeared in front of Gene and Ann numerous times on the record. So it's nice that we're more collegial today and going forward. So thank you, commissioners. But as I said about Teddy Roosevelt and the students, it's really important that you remain engaged. What I loved about this effort, and we at Grid are deeply honored that you chose to focus on this area that we spend our days and lives pursuing. What I love is that, as you'll see today, that this is not a mere academic exercise, though here we are at Princeton, really an effort to understand what are the policy levers. I'm going to be speaking later in the program, but I just want to say that the Princeton students, I think, have really gotten it right. And I hope you'll listen to their remarks and read their final paper. So I won't take any more time except to say welcome, and I look forward to a robust debate today. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So now we're going to transition into the bulk of our program this morning, which is our presentation on solar gardens in the Garden State. It's our community solar policy recommendations for the state of New Jersey. Before I dive in, I want to just do a quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of community solar and work with it kind of in your day-to-day job? So maybe 2/3, great. And then how many folks are from New Jersey, working in New Jersey? Okay, so most people, great. So the topic material should be familiar to most of you. For those of you who don't engage so much with community solar, we'll be talking a little bit more about what that is later on in the presentation, but you should just sort of think of it as it's a way, if you don't have the opportunity to have solar on your own house, it's a way to buy into a shared collection of solar panels that's located near your house somewhere else in your community. So I'm going to start telling you a little bit more about who we are, what the project we're working on is. So Princeton Princeton's Policy School Masters of Public Affairs program, rather than having students do independent research projects, has students work in teams of 8 to 10 in these graduate policy consulting groups where you work with the client, often a state government or a nonprofit or a think tank on some kind of key policy issue. You do a presentation and then you prepare a final report of recommendations. So we were privileged to be able to work with Grid Alternatives on our policy workshop, but we do intend the final report to be broader and more applicable to policymakers in the state of New Jersey. So like I said, the final report will do two things. First of all, it'll provide an overview for policymakers of the benefits and obstacles of community solar with specific focus on how community solar could play in New Jersey. And then it provides specific recommendations for potential community solar legislation to establish a statewide community solar program in the state. These recommendations are based on three things: an extensive peer review and gray literature, interviews with more than 100 subject matter experts and practitioners, both in the tri-state area and across the country. Many of you are here today. We're part of that 100. And then field work that we did in 3 states that have already implemented community solar programs: California, Hawaii, and Minnesota. And we'll be talking more throughout the presentation and in the report about the specific lessons that we learned from those case studies. A little bit more about who we are. Like I said, all of us are in Princeton's public affairs program. 7 of us are doing the Masters of Public Affairs degree. We have 1 MPA/Master of Engineering, and then 1 student who wasn't able to be with us today is doing his PhD in the program. We're all focusing in some extent on science, environment, and technology policy. We come from different backgrounds working in this space. Some of us more on the energy front, some of us more on other environmental topics, but we bring a diversity of viewpoints and expertise areas to this subject. And then we're also excited to be advised by 2 experts in this space, Ann Hoskins, who's the former commissioner of Maryland Public Service Commission and now Chief Policy Officer at Sunrun. So we're particularly grateful to her for shuttling back and forth across the country these past couple of months. There was a lot of 6 a.m. Skyping in from Ann. And then also Gene Fox, who is the former commissioner and president of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. So the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the state of New Jersey, what energy looks like in the state, specifically solar and renewable energy. Since so many of you work in this area in New Jersey, you're already familiar with this, but we'll still take a minute to plug New Jersey as an excellent leader in the space of solar and renewable energy. So it's been ranked 4th in the country as a top solar state. It's one of only 3 states to have more than 1 gigawatt of installed solar capacity after California and Arizona. This isn't an accident. This is because New Jersey has a history of successful and innovative solar policies, including an aggressive net metering program, solar carve-out in the renewable portfolio standard, and then a solar renewable energy credit market that enables trading of the credits from the solar RPS. But many people still lack access to solar in New Jersey, as in the rest of the country. We see that community solar, other approaches to expanding solar access would serve as excellent complements to New Jersey's robust residential and utility scale solar industries. And so that's what we're here to talk to you about today. And now I'm going to turn it over to my teammate, Ari, to talk more about the specifics of community solar and some of the general obstacles and benefits.
Thank you, Hannah. So I would like to explain a little bit more about community solar in general. So United States has installed more than 30 gigawatts of solar capacity by early 2016. Residential solar, as well as utility scale solar, has been growing exponentially during the last couple of years. But what percentage of households cannot host a PV system? Anybody has an idea? Anybody?
7 out of 10 freestanding homes. And then there's all those people in apartments.
That could be the case. Right now, 49% of households lack access in solar, according to NREL. This is because they are renters or because their roofs have no space. But this figure could easily rise if the customers doesn't have enough sufficient access to capital, or they may not have roofs with enough sun. So this means that the community solar, which even renters can participate in, has the potential to double the residential market. By early 2016, just 0.1 gigawatts of community solar has been installed in the United States, but 1.8 gigawatts of community solar capacity is projected to come online in the next 5 years. Right now, 15 states plus the District of Columbia have policies to facilitate such growth in place. So what is community solar? I would like to explain a little bit more about this. There are many definitions to it, but here we define it as small to medium scale solar system installed off-site. The place could be an open space or unused farmland in the local area. And those systems are shared and provide power to multiple community members who participate in a voluntary program. Also, these community members own the systems and can get financial paybacks from the electricity generation. There are pros and cons for utility scale as well as for residential scale solar. But as you can see in this table, because of its middle scale size, community solar can be an option which complements residential and utility scale solar. First of all, like utility scale, community solar can achieve economies of scale by aggregating the systems because of multiple subscribers. Of course, utility scale could potentially achieve better economies of scale. We put check plus instead of check over there. Moreover, it is easier to, on the other hand, like residential solar, we expect lower transmission costs for community solar because of its closeness to end users. On the other hand, it is easier to site community solar projects because they are smaller in scale than utility scale. Finally, the most important one, community solar is an option which is open to everybody, even renters or low to middle income customers can host the systems and own their share in electricity generation. This equitable access aspect is particularly important for New Jersey, where nearly 40% of residents are renters. And as you can see in this chart, 9 out of top 20 cities with high percentage of renters in the United States are in New Jersey. Additionally, because of its high population density, we can expect a high level of health and environmental benefits in New Jersey from deploying solar, as indicated in dark red in this map. But the benefits are calculated based on avoided emissions of sulfur and particulate matter. Now, I would like to pass on to Jack for the overview of recommendations.
Thanks, Eri. So the bulk of our presentation will be us going through some of the specific program structures and policies that we would recommend for community solar in New Jersey. And as Hannah said, this session is part of our writing our final report. So we're really eager to get your responses and feedback about these ideas so that we can incorporate it into the finished product. To begin, I'm going to about what we think should be in community solar legislation. This is actually something that across our interviews in a number of different states, there was pretty wide agreement. People on the whole felt that because inevitably there's going to be problems with any program, the BPU would be able to respond much more quickly and much more flexibly to adjust those problems. So it makes sense to leave specific program details and for the most part, specific numbers about things like program size to the BPU. At the same time, it's unfair to ask the BPU to answer what are essentially political questions. So our recommendation is that successful legislation is going to be specific about the goals and intent of the program, but quite broad about how exactly to implement it, so that the result is something that's flexible and adaptable, which is especially important for community solar, which in the United States as a whole is a relatively new way of doing solar. So specifically, four questions we'd really like to see answered in legislation. First, why does New Jersey want community solar? And this is important because a clear answer to this question can really guide a lot of the specific program details. So for example, a program that's really designed to enhance and maximize the environmental benefits of solar is likely to see large caps on program size, little differentiation between types of customers. On the other hand, a program that's really seen as an alternative to rooftop solar for customers who, as we heard, can't access rooftop solar, is likely to have smaller sizes for individual subscriptions and perhaps a residential carve-out. Second, how should community solar be balanced with other goals? And the question here is really about balancing between setting a rate that will incentivize community solar development and limiting the effects on customers and ratepayers who don't participate. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. Third, community solar, there's a lot of technical challenges surrounding grid integration, partly because it's a new technology and partly because there's a lot of challenges involved in increasing renewable penetration more generally. And successful legislation is both going to direct the BPU to address these things and empower them to do so. And then fourth, and this is really a subset of one, but we think it's especially important, in a lot of states, one of the big motivations for community solar has been helping to expand the benefits of solar to low-income consumers. And it's important to consider whether community solar is right for LMI customers, and if so, what the best way to incentivize them to participate is. So on this second question, I just want to go into a little more detail and compare the Minnesota and California statutes. So the really key words in these entire statutes are those that are underlined. In Minnesota, the statute calls for a rate that will allow for the financing of community solar. And as a result, the resulting rate set by the BPU is quite high, and there was an initial boom in applications. In contrast, California takes essentially the opposite approach and says that however the program is set up, it has to ensure non-participating ratepayer indifference. And the result of this is a very low rate that community solar customers receive, in addition to flexible additional charges that the utility puts on each kilowatt hour generated. And it's hard to know exactly what will happen in California because the results of the first auction haven't yet been made public. But
What does that mean? Non-participating ratepayer indifference?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Good clarifying question.
You said that word, I don't get there.
Basically, what it means is that whether a community solar program exists or a community solar program doesn't exist, if I'm a customer who just subscribes to electricity normally, this can have no impact on my bill or on the reliability of electricity I receive. And it's especially hard with community solar because, as we're going to hear about in a lot more detail soon, the benefits and costs of community solar are often quite hard to value. So that a really strict interpretation of this language is going to set a really low rate, just sort of to be safe.
What do you mean by BPU can do this? But these are all statutes that are done by the legislature, not the BPU.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an example. So this is an example of sort of a more political question. So we would say something like this, like we want a rate that will allow community solar in our state, is the kind of thing that we think it makes sense to put in the
It has to
statute.
be done by the legislature, not the board.
Yeah, absolutely. By the legislature. In contrast, something like a 1 megawatt cap, 5 megawatt cap, more specific program elements at the BPU level.
Let me just make the observation that there are obviously a total difference of legislators in the room. There's obvious advantages to having legislation. New York is an example of a state that has jumped into this pool without specific legislation addressing this. And the New York Public Service Commission sees this program as an extension of the general rate making responsibility as well as responsibility for environmental stewardship.
Yeah, excellent point. And then, yeah, as I was saying, we haven't seen the results of the first auction in California, but because of this clause and the resulting low rate, it's generally expected that we're not going to see much, if any, community solar development there. The second important difference between these statutes that I want to point out is that the California statute is much, much more specific. It goes into a lot more detail about how the program has to be run, something that's loosely approximated by the fact that it's about 4 times longer. And the result of this is that while in Minnesota, people realized that the initial rate might have been a little bit too high, but the BPU is able to go back, adjust it, and set a new rate that's going to come into effect at the beginning of next year. In California, if it turns out that the program is not functional as it currently is, there's really no way to fix it, and it will require new legislation before the state sees community solar development. So, this is really more the level of legislation. Many of the other more specific recommendations we'll go into are things that we think should happen more at the level of the BPU. And to start discussing these more specific elements of program design, here is Cherie.
Thanks, Jack. So coming out of our research and our field work, we found there to be several different elements that we think would be helpful to implement here in New Jersey to make the community solar program successful. So I'm going to get into a few of those elements. First, in terms of subscribers, we think it's important that there be a mix of different subscribers to any one particular community solar project. So for this reason, we recommend that any one customer can subscribe up to 40% of a project. This would make sure that there are multiple customers within any one project and prevent any a super large customer from kind of taking over a whole installation. In terms of proximity, we recommend that community solar subscribers be located within the same utility service territory as their community solar garden, and also be located within the same county or adjacent county. This is very similar to what's done in Minnesota. And we think that this gives flexibility to the developers for their siting purposes, and also provides access for many residents throughout the state. Also, besides reducing line losses and transmission costs and improving grid resiliency, we think that having some limitations on proximity will really keep the sense of community in community solar. In terms of project size, we recommend that any one individual project be limited to 5 megawatts in capacity. We think this is large enough for developers to achieve some economies of scale, and also to attract a distinct number of customers to kind of diversify the risk profile of the project. It also kind of avoids utility scale solar from being installed under the guise of this program. And this is one of the key things we took out from our research in Minnesota, where there was a 1 megawatt cap, and then you had some developers coming in and placing many 1 megawatt projects in the same location because there was no co-location limitation, and essentially installing utility scale solar without going through the typical RFP process that would have been required. So we think that if you have a 5 megawatt cap or a larger cap, you kind of deter some of this behavior. Also, we recommend that the project start out with a capacity limit, which is eventually eliminated. So essentially what would happen is the program would start out with a smaller cap, which would be, that limit would be increased as the program, over the life of the program, until it's eventually kind of phased out. So we think this is beneficial for a couple of different reasons. First, it gives utilities and stakeholders time to kind of understand community solar's impact, and also gives the BPU an opportunity to identify issues or problems with community solar that they maybe hadn't thought of before, and kind of resolve them before the program gets any larger. I think it also helps.
What aggregate cap is again?
Sure. So in terms of the entire program size, so we're thinking like, if we're implementing this program in this whole state of New Jersey, what's the total capacity? Sure.
When you say customer, are they all in the same customer class, or does it matter to you? Or you think it doesn't matter?
In this case, we think it doesn't matter. I think having a limitation of up to 40% would prevent, a very large company from kind of taking over one project. So customer class, it doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about inclusion of low and middle income customers into each project. But beyond that, we definitely think that this 40% will make sure that we have a mix of residential, probably small business, and low and middle income folks. So moving on, we believe that the program should be implemented in two phases, a pilot phase and a full implementation phase. So in the pilot phase, we'd have community solar implemented on a smaller scale and kind of allow for stakeholders to study the impact and also identify areas that need to be improved before we move into phase 2. There are also a couple of issues we think that should be worked out during the pilot phase before moving on to phase 2. And one of those is for the utilities to gather information or present information regarding where on the grid would be most benefited by additional capacity from community solar. And we would hope that this information can be available before the pilot begins. But if not, any information that could be made available would be helpful. And then going into phase 2, we'd hope that full information would be published and available to the public. Also, during the pilot phase, we'd expect that we'd be using the applicable retail rate as an interim rate for compensating subscribers, while the value of solar rate is further developed. Kara will talk a little bit, we'll dive deeper into that in a few minutes. So I'm not going to talk about those details right now. Then, so in the phase 2, we'd see an incorporation of the changes that we found in the pilot phase that need to be made. And then we'd see an integration of the locational benefits into the program and also implement the value of solar rate. So question? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just one slide back, you said 5 megawatts. So New Jersey is pretty densely populated and highly developed. So that's about 20 acres.
Yes.
If you're doing it as a ground array. So think about that, because that would be awfully difficult to site, to find a lot of 20-acre sites.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, in terms of definition of community, 2 megawatts is about 200 homes. That's a community of more than maybe 500 or 600 homes if you're doing 5 megawatts. So it's just something to think about.
Yeah, thank you. And again, 5 megawatts is the the upper limit that we're suggesting. So if there is an opportunity, Princeton itself has about a 5 megawatt solar installation. We visited that, and we thought that's just one data point in terms of what could be a possibility or in the realm of possibility. But point taken. Thank you. So now Kara is going to come and talk a little bit more in depth about how we will be crediting subscribers.
Cherie. So how customers are actually receiving the benefits from their community solar program is going to be an incredibly important element to the success of a community solar program in New Jersey. The credit scheme largely determines 3 factors. First, the financial benefits that customers receive from actually subscribing to these projects. Second, the amount that developers can actually charge for subscriptions. And 3, the overall project's financeability. And so overall, we have some 3 kind of large guiding recommendations First, we recommend that legislation should direct the BPU to explore a value of solar credit rate but allow for an interim alternative during phase one. And I'll get more into details of those two different phases. And overall, we believe that any sort of discussions and methodologies used and debated for the value of solar should be inclusive, transparent, predictable, and collaborative. We think that the utilities, customers, developers, policymakers in the state all should be at the table in order to fully realize the costs and benefits that community solar can bring to the system overall and to customers. So phase one, as Cherie pointed out, we think that customers should be credited at the applicable retail rate. We think that I'm just going to refer to it as the ARR. It's a transparent and familiar concept to customers. They see it on their utility bill every month. It's also used for New Jersey's current net energy metering program. And so we really think that this, and for the first phase, is really going to get the program launched as a value of solar methodology is being discussed and thought through during this phase one.
Is there any distinction between your phase one methodology and net energy metering?
It's the retail rate. Yeah, so it's going to be an expansion.
Different acronym.
Excuse me? Yeah, like virtual net metering, for example. And I will, in my next slide, is kind of illustrates that point. So virtual net metering is a common term that is used to describe this bill credit mechanism. It's an expansion of the net energy metering that's used in a number of states across the US. So just for some of you who may not be familiar, but probably most are, traditional net metering, the meter is actually connected to your house. And so that meter is actually rolling backwards. And so any excess energy you are exporting to the grid, you are getting compensated at that applicable retail rate. For virtual net metering, obviously these systems are not on your actual home or residence or business, small business. And so you're actually not seeing that physical roll back of the meter, but you're able to get credited for whatever your subscription is generating on your bill credit. However, we have seen in some states that they are looking at an alternative to net energy metering using this retail rate called the value of solar tariff. And so what a value of solar rate is supposed to do is supposed to monetize the cost and benefits of solar to the system overall. And so the benefits are calculated and the costs are then subtracted from that. And it makes what people call a value stack. And so the most critical elements to determining the value of solar rate is to first select which elements you want to be part of this, and then also determining which methodologies to use to actually monetize these costs and benefits. So for an example, I've listed some commonly used costs and benefits. For example, so the energy and capacity value. The energy value is actually going to be, the avoided fuel cost that your solar energy is supplanting. The value of capacity, this is going to be seen in the sense of using less using centralized generation systems, and then also the ability for solar to reduce the peak capacity needed in the state. For direct benefits, since these community solar facilities, how we are recommending them to be sited, where they're in either the county or the adjacent county, you're going to lower your distribution and obviously transmission capacity needs. And you're also going to be lowering line losses as well. The merit order effects, since solar has some pretty, compared to fossil fuels, lowered operational costs, any marginal power that they are bidding into an RTO auction is going to push fossil fuel power generation lower in the merit order, and therefore could have a reduced effect on the wholesale energy price. Fuel price hedge. Solar, having more solar in the portfolio is going to be is much less volatile than fossil fuel prices, and so that's actually another benefit. And then also increasing resiliency, as you see with many other decentralized power generation. which is an important thing for New Jersey given Superstorm Sandy, and who else knows what kind of disasters might be in the future. And then some of the costs with other, intermittent renewable energy, there's going to be firming expenses. And then also you are interconnecting new facilities onto the grid. And so there's going to be associated interconnection costs. And then there's a bunch of different externalities that comes with solar, obviously. Local pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and there's also some economic effects such as increased use of local workers.
Kara, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
When Grid and the students were talking about this, it's not called out in the PowerPoint, but in their draft final report, obviously the students understand that there's tremendous both direct and indirect economic benefits. That's something they talk about more in their paper, but we've talked about workforce development, job training, the importance of getting a new generation of workers in New Jersey who can do these projects. And so that's something that they've called out in more detail. I just wanted to give you the credit because the PowerPoint doesn't talk about that.
Sure. And so here is, and I just also want to make the point that the value of solar rate is also seen as more beneficial than sometimes using the applicable retail rate for community solar, in the sense that customers are actually buying all of their energy, or they're at the retail rate, and then they're getting credited back on their bill for the solar that is generated. And so you have less of those disputed cost shifts, and they're paying for the use of the system and whatnot. And so here's an example of Minnesota's value stack that they created for their value of solar tariff. This is the 25-year levelized cost of energy. As you can see, the bulk of their value of solar tariff is avoided fuel costs, but then avoided environmental costs is also a large part of it. They used the federal definition or calculation for the social cost of carbon as well as other natural gas emissions in order to come up with these numbers. I also want to point out that in 2018, they're going to start looking at calculating the avoided distribution costs more locationally specific. And we think that this is an important thing for New Jersey to consider as well. So the fact that you are getting credited for more to install these systems in more beneficial locations on the grid. And with that being said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Stephen, and he's going to discuss more about the interconnection recommendations we have.
Morning, everyone. Okay. So as has been discussed a bit already, we're proposing a two-phase process for CDG. The first phase is a pilot. In terms of what we would ask of utilities for phase one, for any data on the grid that's easily accessible, organizable, and publicly publishable, we would ask that the BPU require utilities to disclose that data to inform the initial round of projects that would be plugging into the grid. For phase two, we would ask utilities, or we recommend that the BPU ask utilities to acquire, organize, and publish all the grid data they have, particularly as it relates to grid congestion, so as to inform solar developers where their projects might be most worthwhile once a locational pricing system is in place with the value of solar tariff. Additionally, this has been a large issue for those following the process in New York of interconnection. The gist of what we're recommending is that the BPU do a lot of the homework proactively and preemptively before kind of firing the gun, allowing solar developers to proceed in the state. New York has had some challenges putting the cart before the horse a little bit. So a lot of these projects, especially for the larger ones, given that we're recommending a 5 megawatt cap on projects, are going to require upgrades to the grid, both in terms of the substation used or the particular capacity on a circuit. And we are recommending that the BPU proactively approve a cost sharing mechanism for those necessary upgrades to be paid for and split among the benefiting solar developers. A lot of smart people, Scott included, in New York have been part of a working group.
I don't get the grade.
Have been part of a working group to figure out a cost sharing proposal. The idea is that if you're a solar developer in the state, you want to put a project on a particular piece of the grid. The utility does an interconnection study. They come back to you, the developer, and say, unfortunately, it's going to cost $500,000 to upgrade that piece of the grid. The developer has to pay for that. They have to figure out if their project will still pencil. But if a second developer in the queue is going to come after them, tap into the same piece of the upgraded grid, that second developer should have to pay for their fair share given their project size. And they would pay back the first developer who shelled out the entire sum for that grid upgrade. If there's a third developer and there's still capacity left in that particular circuit or that part of the grid, they too would have to pay their fair share to the first two developers. Again, this, it would be difficult for that first developer to make that decision, given some, a lack of information as to whether it was certain that a second developer was going to come in behind them and compensate them, and it could, delay the financing of that first project. But that could also be potentially worked out between developers in the queue who want to utilize a particular part of the grid. 2 questions.
Or just an observation that the kind of cost sharing mechanisms sound very similar to what FCC has always had in place for microwave relocation.
Okay.
Federal level.
Great.
In other words, microwave sometimes has to be relocated to clear spectrum, and same exact kind of approach where people will come on and afterwards, have a reimbursement obligation.
And that's the FCC's microwave.
Yeah, it's their microwave clearing.
Clearing. Okay, great. Thank you.
2 thoughts. One is we get enough distributed generation like this out into New Jersey, and there's significant societal benefits. And so there could be an argument made to socialize benefits of grid upgrades, number one. Number 2, there's some technology, storage, where the cost of declining quickly, that might and actually has been shown to mitigate some of these impacts that may avoid upgrades. So,
excellent.
Talk about that.
I don't know if we have covered that, potential benefits of storage, but it's something we'll look into for the final report.
Stephen, if I can just make one observation, I want to give the students credit for wrestling with this issue. I was a renewable energy developer for a couple decades. This is a super important issue, and for the policymakers in the room, developers can do a lot, but they can't understand what the grid upgrade issues are prior to filing a request with the utilities. And so getting the rules written right and getting the rules written in a way that benefits the overall grid and thus the overall society is really important. And so this is, I think, one of the, when those of you read the final paper, this is one of the areas where people should spend time. And when this becomes legislation and a BPU case, getting this right will, I think, set the terms of a successful or a less than successful program.
One more comment.
Please.
On that, the one tricky part is I think we're thinking about developers, coming in one after the other.
Right.
Sometimes it's a developer that comes in 1 year and then 10, 15 years another developer comes in. It's hard to wrestle with that.
Right.
So that's part of the challenge of both the grid upgrade and also how you make sure that everybody shares and each developer shares.
That's a great point. Yeah. So there may be an option as, if there's a societal benefit, if that's to be argued, there may be a different methodology that we could undertake. Alternatively, maybe there's a sunset. So after 5 years, that's just the cost of doing business. No, you're not going to be compensated after that point. Okay. Plugging in these projects and how we're going, or I'm sorry, the way in which these projects are going to be approved by the regulating authority. There are 2 basic approaches here. The first is familiar to everyone in the room, request for proposals. The idea is that a utility or other third-party entity managing this process would publish requirements for applications to be considered. It would say, submit your applications by this deadline. We are going to review them against a criteria that we recommend be set by the BPU if the RFP process is followed. There would be a merit order in terms or a ranking of those projects. Given the projects to be selected, those developers would get the green light to continue with the rest of their process. RFPs or kind of reverse auction processes are used in California and Hawaii. And we're going to recommend that in phase one for the pilot, an RFP might actually make more sense because we don't yet have the benefit of putting these projects on the grid where they make most sense. So if the utility, for example, was managing that RFP process, locational benefit could be one of their criteria by which they judge projects. Alternatively, if we had a first come, first serve interconnection queue process for phase one for the pilot, it would just be up to whoever got their application in first, and that locational benefit would not be priced into the process. So aside from an RFP, this is the process that New York has undertaken over the past year or two. It's a first come, first serve interconnection process whereby a public service commission or the BPU would set a date after which, solar developers are free to submit their projects or applications to interconnect, depending upon where they apply and what particular circuit they're tapping into. They would, be considered and enjoy the benefit of a first come, first serve. So there's a huge incentive to get your application in first. However, a lot of the difficulty that New York has faced is that, one, I think the initial application fee to interconnect was only $300 or so in New York. Developers, there were, so arguably we would want that application threshold and the project maturity requirements to be a little bit higher. Project developers also lack good information over, what particular piece of the grid or what substation exactly that projects would utilize, and whether or not a interconnection study would be required, which can be, $30,000 or so, or up to $100,000 in New York, or whether or not a grid capacity upgrade or substation upgrade would be necessary, which could cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the result in New York, lacking that information, the solar developers applied all over the place, and there was also, each utility was flooded with community solar applications, and they did not necessarily have in place a forcing mechanism. Say you did get that first position in the queue, you were under no obligation, is my understanding, to be compelled to move forward in a efficient manner. So you could sit on that project, slow walk that project, go out to lunch, whatever, and all the projects behind you in the queue would have to wait until you made the decision whether or not to move forward. This has prompted officials in New York State to come up with an interconnection queue management proposal, which would basically say you have to meet these high thresholds or benchmarks by these, you've got 30 or 60 days to do so for each requirement. If you don't meet that threshold, say a 25% down payment on the project, you're going to be ejected from the queue, and the person behind you, the developer behind you, is going to be allowed to move forward with their project. So if you can, obviously we are proposing, one, raise the application threshold and requirements a little bit to make, to kind of weed out those developers with unserious projects, and two, figure out a forcing mechanism and a schedule of deadlines that must be met so that you don't have developers sitting on their projects without moving forward.
Steve, if I can just, you can go back, if I can just again praise the students for wrestling with what I consider to be equally important to the earlier issue. We've seen in grid across the country that this issue needs to be resolved at the policy level. We at Grid work with low-income folks exclusively, 80% of area median income or below. We're very concerned about issues of equitable access, environmental justice. We've seen communities of color get squeezed out. So if the policy is designed well, you're going to get a rush, as Stephen said, but we need to make sure that issues of equity and fair access are preserved. And so for the policymakers here today, it's important to, of course, design a good program, but if you design a good program, there's a concern that there'll be a rush of applications, and it may not be a program that's fair in terms of environmental justice and communities of color. So it's not an easy problem to solve, but it's an important one to wrestle with.
This is my last slide, just a couple of the pros and cons of each approach. The RFP is a familiar, established process that people have experience working with, arguably better for CAP programs because lacking a, locational benefits being part of the selection process with a first come, first serve open, interconnection queue process. Whoever is managing the RFP can take locational benefit into account. Some of the drawbacks are that an RFP is arguably slower and less efficient, certainly more administratively burdensome on the managing authority, and arguably results in higher project costs. Benefits of the interconnection queue process, more transparent. Everyone has equal information, including grid data provided by the utilities, creates a level playing field for all developers. There's one start date, that after which you can apply to interconnection, and arguably better for wholesale markets. Some of the drawbacks, as I've already discussed, requires really good grid data to maximize efficiencies and project value, depending upon where they're located. Could lead to a land rush. This is also an issue experienced in New York with developers. There was one in particular who sent a mailer to essentially every landowner in the state saying, I want to buy your land. Freaked out a bunch of local municipality officials, and a lot of them that did not have experience managing solar development. Just, some of these town councils passed solar moratoriums for 3-6 months or so and said, nothing's going to happen here until we figure this problem out. So that can have, negative consequences. And finally, you certainly need, high enough application requirements so as to weed out unserious projects. With that, we're going to continue on with low and moderate income residents with Vivian.
Hey, Stephen. How's everyone doing? We are nearing the end, so I'm glad you're all still with us. For our project and for community solar in general, this is one of the most important aspects to talk about. Many states that are embarking or have already created policies for community solar are specifically interested in bringing access to solar to low and middle income residents, who are perceived to or actually locked out of the traditional solar market. So just to talk a little bit about the benefits of community solar and solar in general. So low-income households face the highest energy burdens. They often spend up to 10% of their incomes on electricity and utility bills. So that, really gives you, or it leaves you with little flexibility in terms of spending on education, on healthcare, on food. So having access to solar can really ease a lot of this burden for low-income households. There's also a really important public education component. A lot of communities, a lot of low-income communities and EJ communities are the most vulnerable to climate change. So they already know this is an important issue, but it's important moving forward that we get everyone on board and have everyone be able to be involved in our transition to clean energy across the country. And so for New Jersey in particular, nearly 1 million New Jersey residents live in poverty, or about 11% of the population. So this is a big component of who we want to be serving that's not already served. Just giving a definition. So a lot of different states have varying definitions on what might be LMI, or low and moderate income. So we recommend that New Jersey use this definition, which is 80% of the statewide area median income. This is a common threshold for a lot of subsidies and assistance programs. So for the year 2015, this would be about $58,000 for a 3-person household in annual income. So not a lot of money. And it's important to design a community solar program that ensures LMI access, but also in New Jersey, especially it's important to create a program that provides access to EJ and LMI communities who have been historically discriminated, face higher environmental burdens, and who would benefit a lot from community solar. So there are a lot of barriers to increasing access to low-income LMI households. We're going to talk about 3 primary ones, but obviously as the program develops, you would want to definitely create a lot of targeted strategies to increase access. So financing, access to capital, and customer outreach. For financing, community solar projects that have low-income and LMI participation often face difficulties securing traditional low-interest loans because the LMI participants might have lower credit scores or they just appear to be risky investments. So this makes community solar projects with LMI participation more expensive to create, less attractive for developers. So we really want to, fix that problem. Access to capital, low-income participants often lack sufficient capital to buy subscriptions to community solar, but that doesn't mean they should be precluded from having the same access to solar. And finally, LMI customers may not be aware of the existence of community solar or may not have full information on the financial benefits. Once a program's rolled out, they may not understand that this could provide equal or greater benefits than the electricity they're already receiving. And so that's a big problem we want to address as well. So some of our proposed solutions. For financing, we recommend that the state provide loan underwriting. So this includes buying down risk for customers with low credit scores. So in Connecticut, they have a state-run green bank that's funded by their clean energy funding. And what it does is it helps people access, or it provides loans for people who may not be able to access traditional loans. And so they can actually, also access solar subscriptions, rooftop solar, things like that. For access to capital, we're recommending, like many other states, to create a carve-out, an LMI carve-out. So this is a minimum amount of participation for community solar developers. So, our recommendation is 5 to 10%. States have different, it ranges from 5 to 20%. And so the issue here in terms of finding that, really good number is that the higher the participation requirement you set, it increases project costs and can delay the process a little bit. So we recommend starting a little bit lower and, revisiting that number as time goes on so that you have a project that starts off well. Yes.
What would the carve-out apply to each individual project?
So we are also kind of wrestling with that question. We're initially recommending it for each developer so that, if there's a certain area where, let's say you could reach a lot of low-income customers, you might have one project that has like 15, 20%. And then if there's an area that doesn't really have as many low-income customers, based on our locational requirements, then you would be able to aggregate those together. Yeah.
Can you give some examples of consumer protections?
Sure. Yeah. So let's jump down and come back up. So for community solar, for low-income households, but for all households in general, actually, it's very important to have consumer protections as you're creating this new program. So in our full report, we make recommendations about standard disclosure checklists for contracts or for what appears on your bill. We also recommend a lot of regulation on marketing practices. In a lot of states, in Hawaii in particular, we've heard, about like predatory practices or perceived predatory practices around solar developers. So we really want to make sure that this is not something that's, going to be, especially for low-income EJ communities, who have been vulnerable to predatory commercial practices. We want to make sure there are robust consumer protections in place.
Can you clarify the loan involved? That's specifically to buy into how does the loan function? Exactly.
Yeah, so there are a few places it could come in, but one is that, let's say a developer is proposing a project and, it has a certain amount of low-income participation. Let's say they, have like 20% low-income participation. They go to a bank and the bank might say, well, there are a lot of people in this project with low credit scores. We're not really sure that they can provide the payback that you need for this project. And so the developer's only offered, a high interest loan. It increases project costs, it increases subscription costs. And so that's where we recommend the government to be able to kind of buy down some of the risk or provide more lower interest loans. So, what this looks like really depends on how the state sets it up.
Vivian, if I can just give some additional, in New York, what we've seen, and I was recently in the governor's office, the most recent statistics I could get and quoted in a meeting recently, there were almost 10,000 projects either energized or put in the queue in Q2 2016 in New York State. 6 of them were low income of the almost 10,000. Wow. And so the market failure here is that the private sector, private developers, because of their perceived low credit scores, the FICO credit scores, essentially the LMI population is unfinanceable. And so what government, I believe, can historically do, and what we're working with the Connecticut Green Bank to overcome this issue, The perceived risk is that low credit score customers won't make payments for whatever term they're buying the solar. But I think if you do an actuarial analysis, you'll see that even, and the statistics bear this out, even low-income folks pay their utility bills. And so government can act as a backstop. There are a variety of mechanisms we can talk about. But the basic concept that the students and we at GRID have talked about is that government essentially rents its very large balance sheet to deal with the perceived issue of low credit scores and bad credit risk, and provide the backstop that allows for the financeability so that private developers can obtain the debt financing to do these projects for a community that's otherwise wouldn't be served.
I endorse and underscore saying meant to your conclusion. I just want to caution everybody not to put too much weight in the New York statistics on the size of the queue, which is a direct result of, I think what Stephen mentioned before, of there being this rush for people just to get into the queue. And we find that usually it's utilities who cite the queue for the horrible end of the world results that are going to occur as all that solar gets interconnected. We're estimating, along with NYSERDA, that only about 20% of that is real, and the rest is air.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Is there any kind of rate alterations in the LMI there? Like you guys, is it basically a little cheaper there, make it easier?
Yeah, so actually that allows me to jump back to one of my points. So New Jersey has a ratepayer assistance program, the New Jersey Universal Service Fund. So for households making less than 175% of the federal poverty line, they receive assistance on electricity and gas. And so we recommend, one of our very fundamental recommendations is to have community solar be included in that. So if you're a community solar subscriber, you would also receive that subsidy, that assistance. We also make a kind of more technical recommendation about allowing for anchor subscribers. So these are large institutions like a school, a hospital, your local municipality that would be able to buy a large capacity in the project. And if a low-income customer can't, pay back their subscription or, needs assistance, then that anchor subscriber can either buy up some of the capacity or subsidize it. So there are a few ways that you can work around that. Yeah.
So maybe a little bit of a red herring, because I would also suggest that low-income communities maybe have their own challenges in terms of marketing this idea.
Yeah.
And so the state might have to do some other outreach and education things. It may not just be a financing issue. Because if you've got 5 to 10% of your subscribers that are low income, that risk is mitigated by the rest of the pool.
Right.
How utility works.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And on the point of customer outreach, we definitely recommend, establishing a lot of partnerships with nonprofits and with programs that are already reaching communities through energy efficiency and low-income assistance programs. So obviously these are households that would already benefit a lot from, solar. So if your house is leaky, you waste a lot of money on the extra electricity and you need an energy efficiency upgrade, it makes sense just to also get, solar energy at the same time. So these are points of contact that already exist and, programs and nonprofits that are doing really excellent work already. So I think, that's definitely a role for the kind of the civil sector to help with reaching a lot of customers. Yeah.
It's a little disappointing to see the bar lowered on the carve out here. And I'm trying to understand what are the other options here. And one of them is that, public charities aren't just outreach workers. Right. They're not just helping, oftentimes train and underwrite potential customers around their credit scores and other things, but they're also developers. Mm-hmm. Did you consider a carve out for charitable developers of solar that would be targeting communities and have the capacity to raise that number quite a lot? There are inherent barriers right now. Mm-hmm. Charities undergoing just the nature of the tax credits that are in place currently. And my sense for those of us that are charitable developers, we really would like to try to level the playing field a little bit here. And this could be an opportunity to do that.
I'm sorry, the only charitable developer that pops to my mind when I hear that term, which I never heard before, is Habitat for Humanity. And that, I'm sure, is not what you mean. Could you just give a few examples?
Well, the organization I've worked with is called ISLES, and we do solar development, we do weatherization and other energy efficiency work, as well as a lot of work around financial competency of the folks that we're talking about here. So, there are organizations across the state who are interested in this, And it just seems to me that, we really could deal with some of the downsides of that by working more creatively with the charitable sector.
Yeah, I mean, Grid Alternatives is a developer's nonprofit. I also, Marty and his wife founded 35 years ago. You were a child. Has been
12.
Yes. Has been doing that for years. And it is something that I think the state would consider because there, Casa Don Pedro in Newark, I mean, there are a lot of really solid charitable nonprofits in New Jersey. The Saint, whatever it is, down in Camden. With Father and
Joseph.
Yes, St. Joe's. There are some really good ones around the state who have been doing things for 30 or more years, and it's probably something that we could talk about.
There's enormous opportunity. New York is full of community-based organizations that are now engaged in the development of all sorts of distributed energy resources, solar just being one of them. And there are ways, and I'll talk about a couple of them that can be incorporated, but it's an essential element of any overarching policy that the state is going to enter into. It's not just limited to community distributed generation.
But these are considered in those community leaders.
Absolutely.
And so you already had the connection with them.
And that's why it's more than just outreach.
Right.
And there's a lot of work going on that can be tapped into. Now, the market structural issue still exists, but there are lots of creative ways to address those.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of questions we're still wrestling with in the report.
You don't have it all answered.
Yeah, I know. And that's why we're looking to you to provide feedback today and, write all these down in your note cards.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of these questions are still being figured out in New Jersey and other states. So that's where we want to keep going. Yeah, and so just to wrap up our presentation, I'm turning it back to Hannah. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we're going in just a minute, we're going to proceed into our first question and answer comment period, and we appreciate the feedback and questions that we've gotten along the way. A couple of points I want to make before we proceed into that period. First, we've talked a lot about this report. It's going to be wonderful. And just by virtue of being here, we have your email address, so you will end up with whether you like it or not. I guess if you really don't want it, you can tell Jack and say, take me off your email list, but you'll all end up getting a copy of that and a copy of the slides that we presented here today, an electronic copy. And then you should all have Jack's email. So if you have additional feedback besides what we talk about here today but what you put on your index cards, then you can email Jack as well. The next kind of big point that I want to make is that, again, we're not proposing community solar as something that would supplant residential or utility scale solar, but the idea is that in order to broaden solar access, we're going to need an all of the above solar approach. And there are areas where residential solar makes sense, there are areas where utility scale solar makes sense, and there are areas where community solar can make sense. And so all of our recommendations are designed around leveling the playing field so that any consumer, any developer can take whatever approach makes sense to advancing community solar in a particular area. And we've seen that if you design a community solar policy intelligently and thoughtfully, it can work. It is working. We saw it work on the ground in places like Minnesota. It's working in other states. On the flip side, there are states like California that didn't put as much thought into their community solar program that are having more challenges. So we think New Jersey can do it, but we think that in order to do it as successfully as possible, it's important to keep some of these key characteristics in mind. So overarching that the legislative statute that establishes the community solar program should be specific in intent, but leave the specific technical details to the BPU and other expert bodies. Second, we propose having a two-phase program, so that pilot stage is really important for identifying any kinds of issues or unforeseen challenges and proactively addressing them before you reach your full implementation stage. Again, we saw this happen in states like Minnesota and New York, where the program went out, all of a sudden there was a big flood of developers and it was challenging to manage all at once. So doing this staged approach, we think will be helpful in greasing the wheels. In that first stage, in order to help get the program out the door and running, we recommend just doing an extension of virtual net metering and using the applicable retail rate to credit consumers. But especially based on Minnesota's successful experience and this growing acceptance of value of solar rate, we recommend that the BPU look into developing a value of solar methodology that could be used in the second phase of the program. We have these limits, proposed limits on the community solar program project size and sort of overall capacity to sort of help ensure that community solar remains for the community and isn't used as a way to skirt certain procedures and just develop what ends up being an effectively utility scale array. So we propose capping the project size at 5 megawatts, though certainly smaller program projects would be welcome. Limiting any one individual subscriber to 40% of the capacity of a given projects and restricting project participation to customers who are in the same county or an adjacent county and also in the same service territory of a given projects. We think making information about the grid transparent, easily available is critical. So that's a recommendation that the BPU look into ways to do that. We recommend using an interconnection queue process rather than an RFP process, though we recognize that there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. And then finally, trying to ensure at least a floor of LMI participation with this 5 to 10% carve out, but then also looking at ways that you can reduce the obstacles to LMI participation so that carve out really is a floor rather than a ceiling, and that you make it possible for LMI customers to participate, and that you make it an attractive proposition for developers and utilities alike to extend participation to LMI communities, because I think that that's one of those big advantages that community solar can offer that's a little bit challenging to achieve with residential and utility scale. So I'm going to leave these recommendations up so that you have them sort of to think about. They're also written out on the one pager. And so then let's transition into some questions. So I know you have them. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm struck by the way that you've identified the key problem, the key injustice as being one where low-income communities are excluded from the kind of boondoggle being created around solar generation. I think there's another injustice that you could address. I mean, in the long term, if this program succeeds, if all these programs succeed, and we have an energy transition away from hydrocarbons and towards solar and wind, the people really left out are the people working now in the hydrocarbon sector, such as coal mines. And if value of solar was considered more broadly, then the contribution that those unemployed workers make to reducing greenhouse gases, right, is something that would be recognized. So, I mean, I have a residential system and I reduce greenhouse gases and I get S ranks for that. But I don't think I really deserve that money. I think the person who deserves that money is the guy no longer digging up coal or moving the machinery out of work in Appalachia because I put up my panels. And I know it's more complex than that, and natural gas comes into it and so on. But if we really succeed in this energy transition, the injustice that may be fixed through a more ample value of solar concept would be the unemployment of people working in the once working in the old energy system.
Thank you. Thanks for that comment. Yeah.
New Jersey already has, by statute in Board Reg, pretty strict limitations on grid supply solar on open space and farmland. So where does community solar fit in? It's kind of a hybrid. It's got to take up a lot of space.
Yeah, right. That's right. So it is a hybrid, which is sort of one of the attractive things that we see for it. So we didn't talk a lot about environmental regulations, other regulations on siting, because we figured, those, right, yes, right. And those are in place, and we expect that they would apply to community solar projects in the same way that they would apply to a utility scale project. Or
yeah, I mean, so that was kind of my question / comment was the land use discussion that's been going on for so long in New Jersey, and also with with traditional net metering, you've got an underutilization of the potential of, say, warehouse rooftops because the load is so small in those, unless it's a refrigerated warehouse, but the load is so small in those that the rooftop is so large, you're not going to put a solar system on there. So it would be interesting to think about, are there ways to encourage community solar to be sited in the built environment?
Yeah,
There
and
are,
I don't know, Sheree, if you have any comments on that, since you were looking a little bit more into the
Yeah, I mean,
siting.
we considered like the open space and kind of inclination in Jersey to kind of a safe open space. So we were considering that and trying to figure out, do we provide incentives for using built spaces, things that are rooftops that are already there. So we have considered that and kind of adjusting the incentives to move towards that type of setup rather than using open farmland. I definitely don't think that farmland would be something that would be kind of amenable to New Jersey at all.
And one example, I guess two examples of that would be in Minnesota, who, they've got one regulation that says basically you can't site it on prime farmland if you have any other options in the area. And then secondly, and they haven't done this, I don't think anyone's done this, but another thing they're exploring right now is adders for a whole bunch of different categories. So the idea being you get the value of solar rate plus a little bonus if you did something that had additional value to Minnesota. And some of the things they're exploring for adders are like locating it in brownfields, looking on.
I mean, I think I would caution or have you guys think about, we don't want to necessarily tell a farmer that they can't do solar if they could farm, because is there also a restriction on them selling it to another type of development? So I guess caution against like putting restrictions on land and development of land that could be then used for another type of development that may be equally.
Sure.
So I think the notion of, okay, how do we encourage? I think community solar, a cornerstone of it will always be this kind of ground mounted aspect, and you need to have that, but also how do we think about encouraging it in other places?
Thank you. Actually, behind you, yeah.
Maybe just to think about it in terms of restrictions on preserved farmland, because that's probably what we're more concerned about. My question though was about whether or not you looked at the labor implications of community solar. So we know that utility scale tends to, those jobs tend to be done by union workers.
Mhm.
And so while we recognize that there's inherent benefits to the workforce development angle, just wondering if you looked at all, since we know that utilities scale is better than residential for union jobs, but how community solar plays into this.
Yeah, Vivian, do you want to talk about
Yeah,
that?
so this is something that we're also developing on the report, but we definitely are new recommendation to have a provision to hire local. And actually in talking about Marty Miles, one of the problems with being able to bring local jobs with solar is that rooftop solar is so disparate, right? You might have a job in North Jersey and in South Jersey, outside of Jersey. So community solar can at least provide some more stability in terms of where the locations of these jobs are. But yeah, there may also be kind of a little bit of a kind of pressure between union jobs and other people who are new to this, but we think that there's complementarity, like putting up a solar panel isn't necessarily
not an issue in New Jersey. If you get a subsidy, if your report is recommending a subsidy or a loan financing, you have to use prevailing wage in New Jersey to install that. So if the recommendation is a low interest financing structure, you have to do prevailing wage. The only incentive not is the SREC.
Well, if you're a megawatt or above, you have to use prevailing wage. And I think that's another question.
5 megawatts would be above.
It would be, and I think is an assumption within your report that projects will receive SRECs. And if it is an assumption, then I think you should also think about what does the SREC market look like? What's the demand curve look like? Where are we now? So in October of this year, we had installed 1.9 gigawatts of solar. The requirement in New Jersey at the end of the energy year, which is May of 2017, is for 1.9 gigawatts of solar. So I think you should look at the RPS curve, when this would be implemented, the timeline for when this would be implemented, what that RPS curve might look like at that point in time. And I guess my point is there's a couple different pieces of policy that have to fit together here.
Yeah, can I just comment? I totally agree. I think everything you said was very valid and important. In terms of how we envision SRECs going to the rate structure, I think we saw it as sort of something that would be that the customer would receive the benefit for. And so, as they've done in some other states, the SRF would sort of be a minimum floor price for the environmental benefits section of the value of solar.
But are they generating SRECs?
They're generating
RECs. What's the supply and demand requirements for this?
This could be the subject.
Another.
Yes.
3 months worth of workshops that we went through.
So I think what we're going to go ahead and do now is transition to our panel because we got started a little bit late and this has gone on, and we're going to have an opportunity for another Q&A period, but I want to make sure that I'm respectful of the panelists' time and that we don't go over when we told them that they had to be here. So I'll just introduce them briefly. You have their bios in a program. But we have Scott Wiener, the Deputy for Markets and Innovation at New York Department of Public Service. We have Robert Socolow, Professor Emeritus at Princeton, also working now on a solar distillate through Princeton's new Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. And Lisa Greenstein, who represents New Jersey's 14th Legislative District and Vice Chair of the Senate Energy and Environmental Committee. So we're going to have about 5 minutes for each remarks from each panelist, and then we'll do another Q&A session, both on the presentation and then from their remarks. So I guess we'll just go ahead and go left to right, if that's okay with you all. And then Linda, you can go ahead and get us started.
I'm Linda Greenstein.